On July 25th, 1946, two black couples were lynched near the bridge behind me between Oconee and Walton counties. This was Roger and Dorothy Malcolm and George and May Dorsey. Now, to understand the climate that led up to this lynching, understand also that there was a certain political attitude in these parts of rural Georgia. In fact, there was a gubernatorial race going on, and one of the most racist governors that Georgia has ever known, Eugene Talmadge, was relying on these conservative rural counties to win him re-election. Basically, the way that it worked back in the day was if you took the greater number of counties, then you would become the governor. So he was relying on the farmers and the tenant workers way out here in Walton County. And he held a rally at which 600 people showed up, including Loy Harrison, who hired out the Dorsey family to work for him as tenant farmers. They were two black tenant farmers. And there was a rally a week later by the opposition to Governor Talmadge, and they got substantially more people at that rally. So Talmadge realized that he needed to drum up support in Walton County. It was very crucial to Talmadge to win every county he possibly could. So what happened was that the Malcolm couple, apparently the husband in that relationship, got into a fight with a prominent local businessman, a friend of Loy Harrison, who had hired out the Dorsey family to work as tenant farmers. And during the course of this fight, he took a couple swings at the guy and actually stabbed him. So of course they take Roger Malcolm and put him in the Walton County Jail just up the road here. Well, it seems to be that Loy Harrison paid his bail, and on the way to bail him out of jail, he goes with the Dorsey couple. He puts both Dorseys in his car, and he also puts the wife of Roger Malcolm, so they, all four of them, go up to get this guy out of jail. And also understand that prior to this, it later came out in the investigation that Talmadge literally spoke with the brother of the man that was stabbed and said, "We'll deal with this Negro problem if we get your support." And back in this time in Georgia, lynch mobs were kind of an accepted part of life. It was considered, you know, a black person whistles at a white woman, you can only give them so much time in jail, but if they are tarred and feathered or hanged from a tree, that will discourage crime in the future. So lynching was actually encouraged by several of our governors, including the infamous Leo Frank lynching several years earlier, where they hanged a Jewish businessman near Atlanta. So understand the governor here literally set up an opportunity for a lynch mob. Now, Loy Harrison, as the employer of the Dorsey family, is a complex character because we don't know whether or not he was intending for the four to be lynched. He was told to change his route because there might be a lynching, but they might have also told him, change your route so that they are lynched here. In any event, it's said that as the car pulled up, 15 to 20 men, all without masks, all without any kind of disguising features, they appeared and they stopped the car. And they pulled out Roger Malcolm. Now, this is the account of Loy Harrison. They pulled out the guy who had just been bailed out of Walton County Jail, and one of the wives spoke up and said, "Don't do this. I recognize you from church. You're all upstanding men, and I know you." Well, they were intending to kill Roger Malcolm, so now that the wife says, "We can identify you," they pull the other three occupants out of the car, tie them to trees, and riddle them with over 60 bullets. And after this, the most infamous aspect of this lynching was they took a Bowie knife and they slit over one of the women's bellies, pulled out the fetus, and played soccer with it on a road near here. Now, what followed was international outrage. Everybody came to see this lynching as an outdated backwater affair, and it became quickly known that the governor or gubernatorial candidate, Eugene Talmadge, was very deeply wrapped up in this. So President Truman sent the pretty new at the time FBI to investigate. They interviewed thousands of people, and the later Georgia governor not Talmadge, but somebody who came after him, offered $10,000 for anybody who had any kind of information. Now, up until the late 90s, the FBI was still investigating this case, but they never brought a single person to justice. Harrison, Loy Harrison, who was driving the car, again, a very interesting figure, used to be in the Ku Klux Klan, but I don't know what to make of him, specifically because he hired out the Dorseys as farmhands, and he didn't appear to have anything the matter in his attitude towards the Dorseys. However, he was at one point associated with the Ku Klux Klan, but many people in the Deep South were. They had millions of members for a period of time, so it's very difficult to make out what his involvement was. But in any case, this story was very clearly covered up, at least on many official levels, by local officials who were very likely involved, and by Governor Talmadge himself. Talmadge narrowly won this county with 200 votes than the opposition, and he became Georgia governor again, and naturally this story was covered up for many years. There is a marker over by the road and the highway, but that marker is very often vandalized. But this lynching here began, or in part began, the modern civil rights movement in Georgia, because people who were, before this, sort of on the fence, began to recognize that this mob violence, if left unchecked, would rip Southern society apart at the seams. Rather than burying the 4 victims of the Morris Ford lynching together, local authorities took every step they could to prevent a memorial from developing. So instead of burying George Dorsey next to his wife May, they buried him next to his sister, who happened to be the wife of Roger Malcolm, the primary target of the lynching. Roger Malcolm was actually buried at an all-black cemetery a good distance from here, and George Dorsey's wife, very sadly, was put in an all-black cemetery a few cities away and given a very flimsy marker. Now, over the years, that marker rotted away, and they extended the parking lot over her remains. Local officials were trying their best to make sure that this did not stick in the public memory, that people forgot about it. And for decades, and even a little bit today, this is something that is not talked about in the Deep South, and if you do talk about it, a lot of attitudes are, why are you dredging up the past like this? Let sleeping dogs lie. And I want to shine a light on the history of the Deep South so as to educate people that it doesn't happen again. When I was growing up in public schooling, I was taught that during World War II, black servicemen had the honor of serving alongside white servicemen, and they were given the GI Bill like everybody else. In reality, George Dorsey, even though he served in World War II, met with prejudice when he made it back. In fact, 1.2 million black men served in World War II, and only about 5,000 of them were able to use the GI Bill, none of them in the Deep South, and even up in the North, they said that the number that was utilizing it was well below 5,000, which is only a fraction of a percent. And this is no way to treat our veterans. And the main target of the Morris Ford lynching was Roger Malcolm, who was killed alongside his wife, Dorothy. Dorothy's brother, George Dorsey, was also in the car and dragged out and killed alongside them. For good measure, the mob also killed George's wife, May Dorsey, and it was 2 young couples, 2 families torn apart at the hands of an angry mob at Morris Ford. And even now, this grave is a little bit overgrown. May your suffering be redeemed in brotherly love. And they are buried in the Chestnut Grove Baptist Church, I believe, just over the county line. And what's interesting is Roger Malcolm was not originally born Roger Malcolm. He worked on a farm close by owned by the Malcolms. In order to get here, you cross up through Roy Malcolm Road. And taking the name of the farm owner sounds a little bit old-fashioned. And what I think is sad and terrifying about entire lives and generations in Georgia is that all of these stones here were the graves of black folks that just couldn't afford a grave marker. And their family and friends would remember who it was buried under the stone until, if you had enough public outcry about your death or you were important enough to be remembered, they would come in and actually leave a marker for you. And most of the stones in this cemetery are, I mean, you've got a couple of grave markers, but you've got a lot of just field stones. And these are as recent as the 60s, 70s, even a couple of 1980s graves. And May Dorsey and a couple other interesting members of the local black community are buried right behind these buildings. In fact, May is buried underneath this parking lot, a concerted effort to hide the past in this part of Georgia. And it's almost a bit of dark humor that state authorities, of course, would place the Georgia Probation Management Office right here. Under the parking lot is buried May Dorsey, a victim of the Morris Ford lynchings, along with her husband, who was a veteran of the Pacific Theater of World War II. And here lies the hidden monument to May Murray Dorsey, the wife of George Dorsey. They were in the backseat of the car when she recognized a number of the lynchers, and according to the driver of the car, J. Loy Harrison, she called out the name of several of the men in the lynch mob. Now, what's so unusual about this is that May and everybody else in that vehicle had lived in that county pretty much all their lives. And another man who had lived in that county was J. Loy Harrison, the driver of the vehicle. And because she knew several of the men in the crowd, there's no reason why the driver wouldn't. But the driver at trial said that he didn't remember the names that she shouted out. And she was buried here, but decades ago, there was basically an effort to push to build a subdivision here. And so a witness cited a truck, a flatbed, riding off with hundreds of tombstones. And this cemetery was almost entirely removed. So now there's no way of knowing who the majority of these people are buried here. But we've still got a couple of graves, and Miss Dorsey was buried next to another member of the Dorsey family and given her own monument. We don't actually know where in the cemetery she's buried, but she is here somewhere. And these crosses are pretty recent. They're placed here after ground-penetrating radar discovered that there were burials. And what I think is so crazy is that this seems like a concerted effort to cart away hundreds of tombstones and have no official record of where they are. Almost a concerted effort to hide the story of May Dorsey and of the Morris Ford lynching in general. And this is to give you a better perspective of where May Dorsey is buried. This whole area here that the road runs through would have at one point been a historically black cemetery, but developers came in and made this building, and you can still see gravestones scattered on the floor and toppled over. The majority of the gravestones, even though no development threatened them, were removed, and people years later had to come back with ground-penetrating radar, and that's all the red flags you see. And some of the few graves left are here at the front of the cemetery, and there's a couple of older, very nicely preserved ones in the back. And no grave was spared, not even Reverend B.J. Laughlin, born just before the Civil War, died just before World War I. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And this is another interesting monument in the cemetery. I wonder if it's in reference to a soldier buried here. Buffalo soldiers were black soldiers, traditionally placed out west. And in southern Texas in 1906, a raid occurred in which basically there was a brawl between black soldiers and members of the town that were treating them very poorly. A white bartender was killed and a white police officer was injured. So basically they discharged without honor 167 soldiers, and none of them could receive their pensions or ever apply for federal civil service jobs again. And the connection this cemetery actually has with the Brownsville raid is that of Esther Crew. It's better explained on the opposite side of that sign. And Esther owned a local boarding house that was used by the detectives immediately following the raid. Esther died in 1935, and it took until the 1970s for the federal government to totally absolve all of the black soldiers based there of any responsibility during the raid. They said that they'd been treated horribly by the townspeople, and there was naturally a protest, and the townspeople saw that as an opportunity for basically mob violence. And Esther Crew is buried in the shadow of May Dorsey. And basically there was no actual pardon of those black men until the 1970s, and by that time almost all of them, if not every last one of them, had passed away, and none of them could perform federal service. And here is May Dorsey, whose husband fought in the Pacific Theater of World War II and was also lynched. There's several veterans buried in this cemetery as well, kind of forgotten to the sands of time. Men like James E. Conyers, born 1892, serving as a private in World War I. And it's interesting to think of the stories of men like this that are now lost to the sands of time. He was actually a very young man when he died, 1933. And another interesting thing to note about these historically black cemeteries is the presence of fraternal orders. Henry Connor was actually a member of the Knights of Pythagoras, and back during the Jim Crow South, black people couldn't meet in groups. There was still concern that they might be planning something, some kind of an insurrection. So they met in fraternal orders that were often based off of the Freemasons, and this was a way for them to get together and even pay for burials without being accused of plotting rebellion.